All right, welcome to part two of American Lit, 1945 to the present. The civil rights movement really gains traction during this period. And of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his advocacy for African Americans was one of the highlights of the civil rights movement. Of course, there were others, the women's rights movement and the gay rights movement, and also the Chicano movement, to say a few. And here we have a picture of Dr. King marching with roughly 10,000 people from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama in 1961. And again, national attention is turning towards these very large activist walkings. And we saw a bit of that with the Black Lives Matter movement too. And there was a lot of, I think, intersection between these two activist moments. A lot of people at the time when Dr. King was emerging wanted to paint him as a communist or somebody who wanted to burn down America. And we saw similar claims to that with the Black Lives Matter movement too. So again, speaking truth to power sometimes brings out the ugliest in people. But we are better for being on the other side of this. And part of the civil rights movement and African American rights movement includes the Freedom Riders, who would do things such as sit in a waiting room at, like, say, bus stops, or at lunch counters that were still segregated, that were still under the effect of Jim Crow law. And we had senators that participated in these events and were beaten just for sitting in the wrong place. For us to look back at this, decades and decades later, we think this might be insane or not the America that we know, but it's a really important part of our history. And there's some very interesting kind of intersections of this. I don't know if you've watched Lovecraft Country on HBO, but it takes H.P. Lovecraft stories and themes and intersects them with other kinds of horror stories, such as the horrors of racism. And that's my phone ringing. I better stop this. All right. I know there was a phone ring in the background. I'm not re-recording through all that. I'm just going to move forward. So, another really important part of the civil rights movement included the desegregation of schools. There was still this notion of separate but equal institutions for African Americans and non-white students on one side and white students on the other. And President Johnson, actually, this wasn't Johnson, it was Eisenhower, had to send in the National Guard to make sure that this happened. Brown versus Board of Education finally makes it illegal to have separate schools based on ethnicity. The story of these first students who had to go to these schools is truly remarkable and a real portrait in courage. And here's a really, really great picture of mothers accompanying their African-American children to an elementary school. But this is here on the West Coast too. Sometimes we think, oh, that just all happened in the South. This is in Oregon, of all places. There's a very similar set of stories that takes place in Southern California, but a lot of them had to do with Latinx populations because they tended to be the predominant minority in the South, in Southern California in some neighborhoods. And there's a very famous case against, I believe it's the Westminster Board of Education. Anyway, really riveting history. A time of tumult and a time where the normal channels of power are being disrupted. And like I said beforehand, women's rights are also at the forefront in this period, including rallying for the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, keep in mind that that still hasn't passed. There are still Congress people that are in opposition to this, and I'm not really sure what the reason is. It makes no sense that there should not be federal protection under law by name for people that are not male. And to even take this idea further, the idea that there is a spectrum of genders that need to be protected under law is something that we are dealing with now. In some ways, the 60s helped to bring these issues to national attention, but transgender rights and gay rights are also really important parallel movements to the equal rights movement for women. Oh, and here comes, of course, activism against the Vietnam War, which was vehement. This is one of the only points in the 20th century in America where there was a draft. And history and documentation has shown us that our involvement in that war was not necessary, and that our very government, especially under John McNamara, lied about what we were doing there and what our progress was and what kinds of casualties were being incurred. So it's a really, really dark moment. And this brings us to a national conversation about the military-industrial complex. There are very powerful corporations in the United States who benefit from war. And there are stockholders that benefit from these companies that benefit from war. And a lot of people during the 60s and the 70s began to realize that war should not be a profiting endeavor. That it is in fact something that we should be working against regardless of profit margins. And in fact, the term military-industrial complex was coined by Dwight Eisenhower, the president, who was one of the top military generals in World War II, but he saw it coming. He saw how powerful these military-industrial combines were, and how much political influence they had, and how much they were, in some ways, opposed to, if not just plainly disregarding of, human life. And like I said earlier, the civil rights movement also included gay rights. The Stonewall riots that happened in 1969 in New York was one of the watershed moments that helped gay people organize to provide activism for their own rights. I mean, before this point, and even past this point, it was possible to be arrested in the United States for being gay. So how does all this relate to literature? Now that we've got the cultural and political and social background, let's take a look at how it's going with relationship to literature. There's the idea of the great American novel. Where does that end up going in the 20th century? I don't know if I really have a great number one pick for the great American novel. I mean, the 20th century is so diverse in terms of its literary offerings. I think you could put Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man up there. It's really great. I think you could make a good, strong argument for John Dos Passos' USA, but there are others as well. Another idea is realism and the death of the novel. Now, the idea of realism, that literary movement from the 19th century, is still alive and well, but there is this continued disruption of the expectations and the structures of the traditional novel and the traditional narrative. And part of this plays into postmodernism, which is not only a literary movement, but also a cultural movement, and also a philosophical movement as well. The idea of minimalism continues to be really, really important after World War II. We saw some very spare writing that breaks down that complicated, very ornate form of writing to something much simpler and sparer. Ernest Hemingway was a big proponent of this, but we also saw it in poetry as well. So the idea of saying less, saying more with less, is still really, really important. This idea of stripping down to the core important components. Metafiction is also really important. Meta just means referring to itself. So fiction that is about fiction becomes something that is really, really important during this period. And you could look to people like, say, Kurt Vonnegut and Breakfast of Champions, and other novels that are about novels, or other pieces of fiction that are about the writing of fiction. Donald Barthelme and his short stories certainly fall into that category. There's this kind of inward turning upon art forms, and this doesn't only happen in literature, it happens in the graphic arts and the plastic arts as well. Oh, and in poetry too, yes. And here comes poetry. The short lyric, as a form of meditation or reflection, is very powerful in this period. And remember, lyric, it just means having a beautiful and song-like quality, almost like song lyrics. In other words, it's expressing an emotional state with appealing flow and word sound. We also have the beat poets that come in the mid-20th century, post-World War II. As part of the Beat generation, they were the precursors to the hippie movement in some ways. They were huge jazz fans, and they helped to refashion what poetry can do and split it even farther away from its very genteel, very prim and proper origins. This is the poetry and the literature of the counterculture in a way. Confessional poetry also becomes very important, especially mid-century. Now, confessional poetry is also known as domestic poetry, and it's poetry that talks about subject matter that usually was not discussed, including family relationships, relationships between two significant others, and the way they have broken down. Remember, the 20th century, especially mid-20th century, is a time for popular psychoanalysis in American culture, especially in the middle class. And so people were often encouraged by psychoanalysts, who are different from psychologists, they're using a more Freudian model probably, to look back at their childhoods and their family relationships for points of trauma that may be somehow unconsciously still affecting them today. So writing about these things, about the terrible ways in which their families had broken down, becomes subject matter in poetry. And we will see that with poets like Sylvia Plath and Adrienne Rich. Deconstruction in language poetry is also really important. And in a way, this is almost like meta poetry. It's poetry about the nature of language and poetry. It's really focused in upon itself, and it's not really telling a larger story. It's not really building or painting a beautiful word painting like we might see in lyric poetry or in imagism, but it's focused on the nature of language and the nature of meaning. And if it's on the deconstruction end of things, it's about how that meaning is constantly being broken down just by its very nature of being language. I've talked a little bit about deconstruction in the beginning as a literary critical movement. It really does kind of find a footing in certain poetic corners during this period. And the field, of course, is diversifying as America in general is diversifying. African Americans in the Black arts movement continue to put African American experience at the forefront of their work, and we'll be looking at some of that work too with Gwendolyn Brooks and Ralph Ellison. Southern writers, we've talked about Faulkner already. We will also be looking at, like I said earlier, Flannery O'Connor, Eudora Welty's also in our anthology, but I can't include everybody. But there's a